today. So I guess even before going into a bit of an agenda for today's meeting, um, we felt it was important to say why we're doing this event. Oh, we have another couple. People. Hello. Hi. So yeah, like the idea behind this event is really giving you a bit of a window into what we do on a day-to-day basis. So some of you might know that a couple of weeks ago we already put together an event, an open evening, in which we opened up our calendars. We basically showed a screenshot of our calendars to show what we do on a day-to-day basis. And it's a bit of a segue to that. In the words of Patrick, one of our founders here, it's really to make you to show you that being a consultant is mainly made up of two elements, right? The content and the craft. So the content really is the what, and the craft is the how. And the content is, even if it might sound counterintuitive, is actually the low-hanging fruit. So everyone can find the information. I mean, you need to get good at it, right? There's like so much information that you can access, and filtering what's important and what's not is an art itself. But really what makes a great consultant is the craft. That is the way that information is delivered, the way that information is communicated to the client, so that it's not just a piece of information, but that information comes with what does it mean, and why the client should care about it, and what should they do with it. So why is that information useful in the first place? So what we're going to do today is give you a bit of an insight into the first part of that combo, which is the content. And what we're going to have is our consultants, newly promoted consultants, that are going to walk us through some of the key topics of interest. We call them hot takes, just because it's some of the very interesting conversations that we're currently having among ourselves or with our clients. And if I just skip it there, yes. So we started a bit later, but I'm sure we're gonna make it. And so we're gonna have Zara talking about oncology and hematology and the disruptive innovation piece. We're at Airdyne, we do a lot of we work a lot with innovation, especially in cell and gene therapy. Then we're going to have Louise talk to us about patient support programs. You might not have heard what these are because they're more important in the US than here, but they're catching up. And it's a super interesting element to look at. Then we have Nat talking to us about digital health. It's growing more and more, and it's going to be one of the sort of like next innovation waves in pharma. It is already, but to know about digital now means to be positioned very well in the future. And then we have Joy talking to us about aducanumab, also called Aduhelm. You might have heard that a drug for Alzheimer's has recently been approved. It's been all over the news. Even my mom knew about this. And there's quite a lot that's happening on a day-to-day basis. And we're, of course, looking at what's happening. And Joy is going to give us a bit of a window into that. Around 7:15, we're going to be joined online by two industry experts. So one representative from Pfizer and one from Gilead, and we'll have the opportunity to ask them directly questions about their career paths, about just how they got there and what it takes to get there, demystify what the other side does, so like our potential clients, but also really to understand what are the different pathways you can take with a degree in science and just in life sciences in general. And we can then close off with another bit of English. And really, again, what this is the first part of that two piece, which is content and craft. And the second part, the craft bit, which is really what makes a valuable client relationship, or what really means success in an interview setting, whatever that might be. consultants, then an industry panel by two of our industry experts. But then I guess the suggestions, the encouragement from us is to ask questions throughout the entire event, because it's really what makes a great consultant is not just the ability to give answers, but to ask the right questions. It's what we look for in people and just in life, I think. So ask away, don't be shy. We'll be asking ourselves. So join us in doing that. So I'll pause here with a banner for our masterclass event next week. Are there any questions at this point? All good? All right. Okay. So I can leave the floor to Zara. Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone, and welcome to, I guess, the first hot take, and my hot take on oncology and hematology, the disruptive features in this space, and more specifically, answering the question, will disruptive innovations reach patients? So, despite the leaps made in oncology and hematology, there's still a way to go. And some reasons being on the left, things like the disparity between indications with different types of cancer in terms of survival. So you can see here with pancreatic cancer, the 5-year survival is 5 to 10 years, whilst with something like melanoma, you can definitely survive much longer than this. And there's also the shift in paradigm where we're stepping away from chemotherapies due to the systemic side effects and to combat resistance mechanisms. And finally, there's the immuno-oncology space. So immuno-oncology is this growing space where you're utilizing your own body's immune system and using that to fight cancer cells. So to address these challenges and trends, there are a couple of trends occurring to solve this. And I've highlighted 4 here. But for the purpose of this talk, I'll be focusing on gene and cell therapy. And this is a space where I've worked in for about a year and a half, and specifically in the disruptive cell and gene area. So what are cell and gene therapies? So these are both therapies which have one-off curative potential. And with gene therapies, the big success in this has been in non-malignant hematological diseases. And for cell therapy, the real success in this has been in liquid tumors, particularly with CAR-Ts. So CAR-Ts are these novel therapies that take a T cell, so a type of white blood cell, and attach a receptor onto it. And this allows targeting of specific types of tumors. So all really exciting stuff, but there is more that is able to push the envelope of this. So what's next for cell and gene therapy? And so you can see on the left, there are various CAR-Ts that are currently on the market, as well as gene therapies. But these do have their limitations to it. So you can see as recently as this year, a CAR-T has been approved in multiple myeloma. But one of the key bottlenecks and limitations to these CAR-Ts is that its manufacturing is highly complex. It has a long turnaround time, meaning the time it takes from taking the cells from the patient. So in cell therapy, you actually use the patient's own cells, ship it off to a factory where it gets made into a CAR-T cell, and it gets shipped back to the patient. And this is quite a lengthy process. And so these upcoming disruptors, as well as future innovators, are looking to solve those issues and really enhance CAR-Ts and cell therapies as a whole. So with these upcoming disruptors, I'll outline a few of them just to give you a flavor of the different solutions they're coming up with to the limitations of these CAR-Ts. So Gracell, with a 24-hour manufacturing, is able to reduce this turnaround time I was speaking about. With Allogene and Fate, they're coming up with what's called an allogeneic approach. This means instead of using the patient's own cells, they're able to use cells from a different source, whether that means by using donor-derived cells or iPSC cells for some of the scientists in the room. And what's very interesting about Fate is that not only do they have allogeneic sources, but they also use a different type of cell. So we have our T cells and we have other cell subtypes. And lastly, when we look at future innovations, these are the companies that are really pushing the barrier and what we're going to look at in the more distant future. And so we have companies like Additive Bio looking into different types of cell therapies, not just CAR T therapies. We have Sana Biotherapeutics, who are looking at your body as a bioreactor, so manufacturing these CAR T cells within your own body. And across both gene and cell therapy, these controllable gene or CAR T expression, and this is controlled by a switch that's turned on or off by a drug. So all very, very exciting stuff, as you can see. But this has very much been some blue skies thinking up until this point in the presentation. So why aren't these therapies in our hands today, tomorrow, even a couple of years from now? And there are a couple of challenges to this. So starting off on the left, this is very much the scientific factors to it. So with the research and clinical side, donor-derived CAR Ts, so those allogeneics I was speaking about, are just not as efficacious as what we have approved on the market. There are particular safety concerns with cell therapies, and gene therapies are very much limited at the moment with its scope of what types of diseases it can treat. Moving across the pharma chain, we also have these manufacturing challenges. So I spoke about the lengthy turnaround time as well as supply chain logistics that are extremely complex when you're dealing with a very personalized therapy. Also, there's been an increased demand for viral vectors, which will impact both cell therapy as well as gene therapy. And as I mentioned before, these cell therapies at the moment are derived from the patient's own cells. And these patients have been heavily pretreated, and therefore their cells aren't really in the most healthy condition to be making these cell therapies, and therefore prone to production failures. We come on to market access and reimbursement challenges, and this is very much about its high cost and how do you get it approved, how do you get it onto the market. And there are various different access requirements across countries as well, which makes it very difficult as a pharma company to have a strategy that works across. And lastly, as was sort of alluded to in the previous slide, there's intense competition in the cell and gene therapy space. And therefore, there can be this limited site bandwidth that may create barriers for other companies to come in. So not all companies have their own manufacturing capabilities, and therefore will have someone else do it, a different vendor do it. But if there are tons of companies need to do this and limited amount of capacity, that creates an issue. And lastly, these next generation assets mean that there's always something new on the cusp. So your cell therapy today might not be particularly relevant in the next 2 or 3 years looking forward. And so these are the major challenges sort of facing the cell and gene therapy world. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are solutions to this. And this is across the scientific, the manufacturing, and the reimbursement areas. So I've just picked out a couple of case studies that really showcase what solutions are able to overcome these challenges. So starting off with Fate Therapeutics, I mentioned before that these allogeneics aren't as efficacious, but interestingly, what they're doing is using gene editing to edit and use multiple edits to put this inside the cells in order to improve its efficacy and its persistence, and therefore prove the viability of allogeneic cell therapies. We then have point-of-care manufacturing. So you're able to get these devices and place it within hospitals to create your CAR Ts. And this fits within a room. And so far, it's had successful manufacturing, as well as some responses. It is worth to note, it's still early days, still limited amount of patients, but what it's able to do is reduce the cost of goods, as well as reduce that time it takes, so eliminating that complex manufacturing process, the logistical elements of it all. And lastly, we look at the pricing side of it. And so these novel cell therapies are high in cost, but there are innovative mechanisms to reimbursement to help improve patient access. An example I pulled out here was a gene therapy where you have this risk sharing model where you're only able to pay, you only pay for performance. So once milestones are reached, you are then able to get payment for it. And this enhances the patient access. So I think that's quite an optimistic note to end on about all these solutions that are addressing the challenges spoken about today. And with that, I will take any questions.
Even if you haven't understood like something specific, we'd like to know.
So you say that Fate Therapeutics is trying to make iPSCs for having like off-the-shelf NK cells. Is anyone trying to like make iPSC lines from patients so that you could have autologous therapies and getting an iPSC line and then using that to like people to continue to treat the same patient? Does that make sense?
So essentially making,
like instead of making autologous from one treatment, that can be a problem that's not efficacious enough for that patient. So maybe if you make a line that can then treat the same patient multiple times, would that be more cost effective as a treatment?
So I'm not sure whether it would be as cost effective because you're only having one source per patient. So that's one of the reasons why autologous cell therapies are extremely expensive, is because it's one source, one whole manufacturing process for one patient, as opposed to having something like allogeneics, where you are able to distribute the cost if you have one cell line and have that scalable manufacturing element to it that you don't really see with autologous cell therapies.
I have a question for the crowd. Like all of the like innovators that you mentioned are mostly biotechs.
Yeah.
Right? How does pharma like interact with those biotechs?
Yeah, they definitely monitor them, hence our role in it all. So we see various types of interactions, right? And the level of interaction is also different based upon that big pharma's vision for cell therapy, cell and gene therapy, right? It is a very novel platform, but that comes with risk, and therefore the way they interact with these biotechs or these next generation solutions is very different. So either one, they have in-house capabilities to build them up. I guess that's probably one of the high risk approaches. They have these collaborations and partnerships to co-develop, or more peripherally, they do have venture capital arms for which they can, from a distance, watch, invest, see how that cell therapy or gene therapy evolves, whilst building that relationship very early on with these biotechs. And as you can see, you're looking at very future innovators, right? And these are still in the proof of concept stage, very high risk. So that might be a way to access these technologies or make sure that when they do, or if they do show good results, that you're going to be first in line to collaborate or even acquire them one day.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had a question. So if you want to collaborate with the biotech, do you think it's better to collaborate in the early phase, like in phase 1, phase 2, or just wait till they get to the phase where like everything is okay and now we can get in?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it depends. It depends on the pharmaceutical company and their level of risk tolerance. I think it's more about their vision of what the cell and gene therapy arm looks like. Do they have a risk appetite? Do they see cell and gene therapy as an integral part of their oncology business? If they do, they're more likely to take these risks. But also, say if you're later to the game in cell and gene therapy, you're going to have to make these sort of bigger moves to leapfrog what's already been done. So if I was a pharma company, I would not be investing in sort of a regular CAR T that you see that's already approved. You should be leapfrogging that and seeing what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
Maybe we can just take one more question. There's one more.
There was a question on the stream. They asked, it seems like the manufacturing process has not been optimized. In your view, is this because of lack of economy of scale or lack of expertise? It's from Nasham.
I mean, I agree. It hasn't been optimized, and surprisingly, we've done quite a bit of research in cell therapy and gene therapy manufacturing, and you'll be surprised to where the real bottleneck is. So there's the manufacturing stage, and we can get this down in cell therapy to under 24 hours. But the real bottleneck is these quality checks or release testings that you have to do. So after you make your gene cell therapy, you have to do multiple tests in order to make sure that it's safe to put in a patient. But if your cell therapy takes, let's say, 24 hours, you have a test, a sterility test that can take 10 days. So no matter how much you reduce your time, you're still going to be bothered by that 10 days. So that's the real bottleneck, and you need to innovate in order to reduce that. And so far, there hasn't been any real innovation to reduce that time or reduce that time safely.
Thank you, Zara, for that wonderful presentation. Now, with this discussion that we're having right now, I just want you to take away 2 things. Right? Number 1, what are patient support programs? And number 2, why is pharma bad at being good? Okay. Now, when I ask you a question, please answer, because this is not rhetorical. I really need your participation. So, for the first question, what are patient support programs? It's quite straightforward, right? Quite literal, it's already in the words. Any services that are supporting patients. I think the more interesting question is, why is pharma bad at being good? And we'll get back to this in a bit. So my first question is, since the first one is quite literal, I think a better way to frame it would be, what is pharma actually selling? Anyway, what is pharma selling? Hope. Anyone else?
Drugs.
That's a good answer. Drugs.
Yeah, pharmaceuticals.
Pharmaceuticals, products, right? But when we look at it that way, the good answer is actually hope. And if you think about it, it's the well-being. It's having that peace of mind that you're not going to be bothered by your condition. If we look at it that way and we frame the question in that broad sense, now we take a look at things like beyond the pill. They're not just selling the product itself. They're selling the whole experience, right? When you buy a phone, you expect that you would get software updates. You would expect that you would get warranty, right? Or you would expect that it would work with your other devices, such as what Apple is doing with their ecosystem. So the question here is, the more compelling question is, why do they even need to provide these services? Why not just provide a drug? And then the answer is actually quite simple. So number 1, it's on adherence. A lot of patients are not taking their drugs properly, and it's costing the healthcare system billions, right? So if we look at it, when we define adherence, it's not just if they are taking the drugs, it's more of, are they taking it properly? Are they ensuring that the other factors of their life are not affecting or not increasing the irritations caused by their conditions? And it can be boiled down by a couple of things. Number 1, it's extremely expensive. Number 2, these drugs are getting so complex. It's not just a pill. Some of them are injectables. Some of them you have to put in your refrigerator. Some of them require cold storage and specialty transport. So it's super expensive. It's confusing as heck. And a lot of the products are really, really getting more complex, right? So when we talk about these things, it's not just about a pill that we can buy over the counter. I'm referring to specialty medication, things like biologics, things that you normally take when you have a chronic condition, let's say. And now, of course, what are these services that pharmaceutical companies are actually offering to help patients address these simple issues? Let's go through them one by one. Right? So it's quite simple. The first one, patient education. Let them know about their condition. How can they cope about it? How would the pharma company, with the drug and the education part, make sure that the patient knows what they're getting into? This is going to be their life now. Number two, we have starter kits, what we have here. Literally, they would provide you with a bag that looks like this, and it would be a starter kit. It may contain a flash drive, brochures, some contact information of people that they can talk to, anything that would help the individuals cope with the upcoming condition, knowing that their lives has been changed forever. Number three, it's on the financial side of things. We take it for granted here, but in countries where you have a private healthcare system like the US, it's actually quite expensive. You're not even sure if the patients can access the drug that we are discussing. Some of them would cost maybe $10,000 a month, and that would literally bankrupt some patients in the US. And a couple of other services here at number four, where maybe they would require a bit more high touch. Maybe they need a nurse to teach them how to inject the drug. Or maybe they need to call to a call center to make sure that they understand insurance, to make sure that they understand the financial side of things. Or maybe they just need someone to talk to. It can even be as simple as that, right? And then the next one here is the whole digital platform. A lot of companies are now designing mobile apps, designing digital experiences to help patients. One of the simple ways to do this is by maybe providing them a locator app where they can just find the nearest toilet if they're having a chronic condition on their IG. So a lot of these digital experiences are being designed by pharma companies to support the drugs that they are also providing. And what we have here is simply connecting them to other people. Maybe there are patient advocacy groups or other patient groups where they would find a lot of value in just being able to have those discussions, right? And of course, number seven, the most important one, sometimes it's just knowing that other people care. It's really as simple as that. This is something that a lot of pharma companies take for granted, but for an individual who has a chronic condition, this is massive. And we've seen that with COVID, with a lot of people being isolated, and a lot of the demand has been on touching up on this number seven. So this sounds like patient-centric, like a lot of these more companies are doing this because they want to appear patient-centric and they want to focus on their target audience, which is, of course, the patient. Now, can someone have a guess on how much pharma companies spend developing all of these on an annual basis? Give me a number. Number? 15 billion, down, higher. number, anyway. 5 billion. That's actually precise. But yes, so 5 billion US dollars, and that's just for like last year alone, right? Now the real question is, they're investing so much money on these things, but what's in it for them? Why are they even doing it? So of course, it's not just for the patient, it's also for the pharmaceutical company. Number one is an increase in trend in terms of value-based healthcare. A lot of the payer systems, whether it's governments or national healthcare systems, are now looking at outcomes-based agreements. When they try to assess if they're going to reimburse or even pay for that drug, they see, okay, maybe we can have it in a pay-by-result system. If the drug goes well, we'll pay for it. And that depends on if the patient is actually taking it properly, right? It depends if the patient have that proper support system outside of just the drug that they're taking. So that's number one. Number two is offsetting the increasing prices, right? If the healthcare systems are paying huge amount of money, they expect something more in return than just the actual treatment. So it's becoming more of a competition for these companies to see who can provide the best support system to the patients. And lastly, it's adopting that patient-centric approach. Why? Because now when you talk to regulators, when you talk to payers, when you have those health technology assessments, a lot of them are now asking about the patient voice, especially on the side of patient advocacy groups. So these are all working in pharma's favor. They're not just doing it for the patients, but they're also doing it for themselves. Now, it sounds like a win-win scenario, right? So what's happening? Why are they, let's go back to the title question earlier. Why is pharma bad at being good? Well, it's because no one's using it. That's the big question here. Why is no one using it? So they burned up around $5 billion a year, but only 3% of the actual patients are using these services. Think about it. It's for free. It's accessible. You get free drugs. You get free support. You get to call a nurse on a weekly basis. Why would you not use it? Any possible suggestions on why?
Bad advertisement.
Hmm?
Bad advertisement.
Okay, bad advertisement. What else? They don't have time. Anyone else?
What's the role of the prescriber in this case? Surely they're also support.
Yes.
So doesn't that put into question the value of them?
Definitely. So it's all, David.
They don't want to think about the disease outside of taking treatment.
Exactly. So it's a combination of all of these, and we can boil it down to two words: awareness and familiarity. So first one is awareness. Number one, yeah, bad advertisement. What pharma companies are saying is ask your doctor about it, but doctors can't be bothered to educate the patient on what these services are, even though in theory it would help them decrease their burden in terms of their work, right? So, and also when you were talking about the prescribers, that's actually correct. So 50% of the patients hear about these PSPs or patient support programs from their prescribers. 10% hear it from their pharmacists, and another 14% just hear it online. So overall, it's just on the patient education side of things, which is a simple answer to the question, why is pharma so bad at being good? They just lost the whole communication side of things. They weren't able to connect to their audience. They invested so much money, but at the end of the day, it's the simple things that matter. That's it. Any questions?
Surely they know about this, but have they taken any actions to correct that?
Yes, so a lot of the actions, unfortunately, went to more advertising, but that's not the point. Patients may be aware, but the problem is they don't know the details. They don't know the answers to questions like, are they even eligible to do this? Can they benefit from these services? It's the simple hows and whys that trips them up instead of the actual awareness levels. So at this point, I would say that the resources are still not being put into the right buckets for allocation.
It also seems like there's too much on offer, and as a patient, you might get decision fatigue based on the fact that there is so much. Is that something that they've seen to help prioritize their offerings to be much more impactful to patients?
Yes, I would say. And what companies are starting to do now is to have an actual patient journey mapped out for them, right? When we do these projects, it's part of what we actually assess. Now we compare different services, and then we boil it down to what would be the essentials that the patient may receive so that they wouldn't get confused. And it's part of what we have worked on previous projects.
I mean, maybe just more comment. I saw something in the news this morning about Novartis setting up a kind of pseudo Netflix for their communities, and often it's just in the branding. My sense is pharma historically haven't been good at really understanding the kind of B2C access, because B2B is about prescribers or payers. That bit is quite well established. But in terms of the difference in understanding a consumer, stroke patient, companies like Apple and et cetera, I imagine are much better at having a full understanding of exactly how they consume stuff, how they consume information, how they consume education.
Definitely, from a cross-industry standpoint, I would say pharma has a lot to learn from media and also from technology companies.
Just a quick one. Do you think patient support services are now a prerequisite to play?
Not anywhere. So in chronic, I would say yes. The real question is, what would be the cost of entry? What you consider as the baseline for a drug that's just about to launch versus what's not really necessary. So that's what it boils down to. And that's what we need to figure out if you're launching a drug.
I think it'd be interesting to see whether, you know, obviously R&D and, you know, the pill itself has a huge budget, but at what point, you know, the wraparound starts to kind of compete with the investments that are made in the technology itself, and it becomes almost like an additional R&D element of the business.
Yes, we can look at the ratio pharma spending on, let's say, marketing versus the actual R&D, and maybe we can go about it like, okay, you're spending that much on marketing. Why not put it in making sure that your patients are actually aware of what you're offering?
Hello. My name's Nat. I'm also a consultant with everybody else here, and I'm going to walk you through some of the digital offerings, the different types of digital that have been integrated both from a wider pharma perspective, but also in a very niche kind of therapeutic aspect. So first of all, there is digital health, one of the first three approaches. So this is not necessarily as regulated as some of the other pharma aspects, and it can be used not just in the pharma, but also the general health and well-being of patients, which in turn does actually affect, of course, the health of those patients and the clinical side of things. As you can see here, there are a large number of companies that are approaching this kind of thing. For one, Science33, this is a company that have a platform which really help to optimize clinical trial design, patient selection, and also the gathering of data, but not so much in a patient-specific way, but more of a design and optimization approach. We've then got digital medicine. Digital medicine, in the pharma sense, is a highly regulated approach, where this will be supporting, similar to Luis was saying, in a support program for patients, whether this be a watch, whether this be some kind of platform to help the treatment process, and it will require some level of clinical evidence to support it. And then finally, there are digital therapeutics. These actually feed the data back from the patient and actually which help treat or shape the treatment algorithm for that patient and how they will progress in terms of treatment progress. And as you look through these three different circles and these different level of specificity, there is an increasing amount of clinical evidence that is needed. And we have a quote here from a very strong advocate of the digital health space. Digital has becoming, as Alara said at the beginning, has become a hot topic over the last few years. But the likelihood is, in a few years, this will just be health. Digital will be a standard, expected thing in every treatment algorithm.
Matt.
Yeah.
Quick question. For digital therapeutics, is that a replacement of the drug itself? So there is no actual tablet to take?
Yeah, I believe so. I think it does physically help that patient journey rather than just like a traditional tablet. It will help change the patient's impact.
Yeah, so it's not a companion.
No, it's
an actual like treatment that needs to be prescribed, and it's been clinically validated to have some impact on a patient, the same way that a pill would do.
I think for Banyan, we'll probably fall more into the digital medicine kind of thing, just going with that treatment as well. And as you can see, a lot of the big pharma players are investing pretty heavily into this. We've seen Novartis partner with Pear Therapeutics, although it didn't go particularly well. There are a lot of deep sort of investments in throwing themselves into this because they do believe this is the future. You've also got cross-industry platforms or consortia who really try to represent the industry, the researchers, and actually kind of set a standard and help these players kind of get into that space. And then finally, there are also some non-conventional players such as Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, and Microsoft, who are really looking to kind of enter this space. Amazon, who, as we all know, really want to be the everything store. They are opening or looking to open sort of AI-driven digital pharmacies, removing the need for a pharmacist to some degree. And then moving on to the next stage, I just really want to demonstrate how digital health and digital medicine, digital therapeutics can actually be integrated into pretty much every single step of the pharmaceutical value chain. First of all, there is the expanding, the accelerating, the globe to market value before you even get to that commercial stage. How do you actually optimize that journey so that it doesn't set itself up for failure. You don't have late stage clinical trials, or you try and minimize that at least. And to start with that target discovery, there are thousands of tens of thousands of targets. Normally in the traditional manner, why don't you make this digital? Use digital modeling systems to actually optimize this so you don't have to do that physically. Advancing the medicines through diagnostics, trying to understand the perfect patient population to actually be treated with that therapy. They're accelerating clinical trials. As we know, clinical trials are by far the longest period of time in that two-journey market. Really try to optimize that design through modeling, getting the patient recruitment on spec will really help get to accelerate that real bottleneck in the journey. Then there's also the later stage. How do you capture that data? How do you demonstrate value to key stakeholders? As Zara said, things like cell and gene therapies manufacturing is very complex. So actually looking how to automate it, remove human error, which always happens unfortunately. Also trying to optimize long end-to-end supply chains, whether it's be pure just visibility, just so people know where the product is, when it's delayed, in order to how it will affect their treatment. There's also demonstrating value, actually generating the data to show value in outcome-based agreements or risk-sharing agreements. Digital resources and solutions can help do this. But then finally, there's obviously the challenge of digital is a fairly new topic in the grand scheme of things. You need to make sure if you're investing in it, you have the right people, you have the expertise. You also need to make sure that everybody who's been in that traditional pharma sense can understand it, knows how to integrate that into their conventional methods. And there's also genuinely the infrastructure. It costs a fortune to integrate some of these digital solutions, whether you get a consultancy, whether you integrate this in-house, that is obviously something you need to decide. But all in all of this feeds into the big pharma dynamic. I just quickly want to go through a key example, a deep dive. CAR-T, I won't go over this again, but because Zara went through it in quite a lot of depth, but just to reiterate the challenges and how digital can affect it and support it. They're highly expensive, they're clinically complicated, highly complex manufacturing, and the supply chain is challenging. So a few pharma companies, especially those entrenched in the commercial side of things in terms of CAR-T, are Novartis, Kite, BMS, and also Janssen. They have a digital platform that really looks to map out their CAR-T journey. As an example, Cell Therapy 360, a product that BMS have for their CAR-Ts, Breyanzi and Abecma, really look to encapsulate the entire value chain in this. So ordering, so when an HCP, a physician wants to order a CAR-T, they have a single platform that they can go to that's simple, it's easy to understand, and also they can fill in all the details for the patient in one space. There is the apheresis, which is withdrawing the blood. That is simply making sure that everything is done correctly, on time, everything is processed correctly, all within this one platform. Then there is the manufacturing. This can be also monitoring where it is in the value chain, the delivery in terms of the complexities of delivering from the US to Japan and vice versa. There is also the administration similar to apheresis. And then there is also, quite importantly, the adverse events monitoring. These therapies can have significant side effects, so which actually can be devastating some people and sometimes very difficult to monitor. BMS have a wearable device which monitors the temperature of the patient, the heartbeat, and actually provide HCPs early warning that the patient is in trouble and needs some intervention. And then there is finally the market access, the reimbursement side of things. So as they say, they are very expensive. Identifying patients that could benefit for some maybe financial support in the US, where this will be providing the drug for free, or also just identifying patients that will actually meet the criteria and could benefit from some of these. Ideally, just a one-stop shop for CAR-T in this quite complex process. And then finally, just to run over a few key areas. Research and development, drug candidate selection, as I mentioned, minimizing the late stage failure, which costs companies billions. optimizing logistics and the manufacturing side of things, automate this, look for efficiencies, and sometimes even just model the warehouses and the facilities to maximize your space. Clinical excellence, making sure the patients you recruit are the best and will likely have the best outcomes for those treatments. The adherence, as Luis was talking about, to those patients, making sure the treatments are followed correctly. And then finally, increasing those, the market access, the patient side of things, and also just generally the value of those medicines, making sure that the value is demonstrated, increasing access, and also flexibility of treatment. If somebody can be treated from the comfort of their home, why don't let them? A whistle-stop tour of digital health. Any questions on this?
I have a question about, do you feel the sort of responsibility of regulating these technologies sort of like medical data can be very unrepresented, and these digital technologies might not help people with their medical data, like it hasn't been integrated and built in the systems. So does it fall on like the pharma companies, or I don't know, the people sort of licensing this? Do you feel
Yeah,
like
sure.
Regulating
Good question.
correctly?
Yeah, no, I understand what you mean. So good question. So ideally, when you're talking about digital medicine, digital therapeutics, there will be clinical data that will demonstrate some evidence that it works. So the regulators should arguably only approve it if it is robust enough. But then again, of course, that clinical data is pretty different from real world data. If you then roll this out to thousands and thousands of patients, it does then fall, I suppose, to the setting the standard to the industry-wide affiliates. So these alliances setting the standard of what should be reported, a gold standard, so everybody can look at this. But then, of course, it does fall down to the pharma company to actually use that appropriately and not in an inappropriate way. So there's different tiers, and there should be different barriers that you have to pass for it to not be abused or not be used inappropriately. But experience is probably the best approach to this. We're all learning, really.
But to your question, I think this is just an answer that doesn't exist yet. Like regulators are lagging behind because digital health is moving so fast that it's just very hard to keep pace with it. And for example, like with COVID, just stopping everything else because regulators have to work on that. It's just proven very hard to like keep on track with all of these novelties. There are like a lot of regulations on where data should be stored and how it should be used, but as Nat said, those alliances are like leading the way in setting what the standard is, almost like playing the part of the regulators, right? And then hoping that regulators will just accept the policies that have been put in place by them.
So you've shown how digital enhancements can really add value to product right the way through the supply chain. So I was just wondering how is the industry looking at the moment? Do you have like lots of sort of smaller biotechs and farmers each tailoring a specific digital enhancement, or are there a few big players who are trying to encompass that entire chain?
Good question. So there are lots and lots of people trying different approaches. So some of the bigger ones like Alphabet, for example, or Verify, they're looking at multiple different things, but there are smaller biotechs, digital solutions finders. They're looking at very specific things. So some are like Click Therapeutics are looking at a specific therapeutic that can actually just for the management of schizophrenia, very specific, very focused, and arguably if you focus on one thing and put all of your efforts in, hopefully it means that it can, it will be successful. But then like pharma, there are some people who are trying to have an all-encompassing platform for looking at maybe mental health as a whole. So there are multiple different opportunities for success, and they don't fall just on one product or one solution, basically. Different approaches, different levels of investment, and some are doing it internally and then acquiring smaller digital companies or partnering with them, or some digital companies just going on their own. So
I think it also plays into the value of digital within their broader strategy. Like you would buy in potentially a new mechanism of action, companies are doing the same, depending on how much they value digital as a future pillar of value. So I think similar acquisition or partnership model is what we are seeing for some of the smaller players now mentioned.
All right, I think we need to go to the last one. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there. I'll be presenting the last hot take. Dare I say the hottest take of them all? I don't know. But I will be talking about, switching gears a little bit, talking about neuroscience. And neuroscience is an incredibly challenging therapeutic area to commercialize and innovate in. And I can think of no better case study, more controversial and representative of the challenges and maybe also the hopes of innovating in a new space than aducanumab. Before I get started, I know Ilaria said that everyone has maybe heard about this drug. How many of you have actually heard about it, seen it in the news? Okay, basically everyone. Perfect. And my presentation aims to answer the question: has aducanumab doomed AD from the start? Is it over before it even begins, or actually is it an opening of the floodgates? And as a small spoiler, I would hope that with all the media circus surrounding this drug, that I can maybe convince you of the latter. So I mentioned that neuroscience, and Alzheimer's particularly, is an incredibly challenging area to operate in from a pharma perspective. But why is this? What challenges do we face? This can kind of be chalked down to more technical scientific challenges on the development side, but also societal and health system challenges. On the left, you have risky R&D. Alzheimer's, mechanisms of action for Alzheimer's disease that maybe in a preclinical setting seem quite promising have actually gone on to fail around 200 times, in fact, in late-stage clinical trials, much to the chagrin of patients who are hoping for a new drug for a chronic condition, but also to pharma who are really spending billions on these research programs. If we move more into the health system side of things, there's an incredible lack of health infrastructure to support Alzheimer's patients at present. Despite millions of patients in the United States and in Europe, there really isn't access to testing, to support, especially for patients in the early stage of Alzheimer's disease, where treatment might be most effective. Moreover, the wait lists to see specialists who can actually identify patients at the stage of disease are getting longer and longer. And not to mention, we are living longer and longer, so these neurodegenerative conditions are only becoming more common. And we should also think on the far side, on the more emotional and soft side, there still is a huge stigma associated with memory issues. And this actually even permeates into the healthcare setting where primary care physicians feel that Alzheimer's is a futile disease. There's nothing you can do. And it even goes so far as to them not disclosing the diagnosis to their patients. So evidently, we have a lot of challenges when operating in Alzheimer's disease. These are things that pharma is going to have to overcome if they are to commercialize a drug in this area. However, commercialization persists, and we do have maybe a first class of disease-modifying therapies that's kind of breaking through and hopefully will be launching in the next couple of years. So I'm talking, of course, about anti-amyloid monoclonal antibodies. So in Alzheimer's, and I apologize to the scientists in the room, I'm going to oversimplify this. Within Alzheimer's, there's a protein called amyloid beta, which accumulates in the brains of Alzheimer's disease patients and creates plaques. These plaques are then hypothesized to lead to neurodegeneration and neuroinflammation, leading to Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So these monoclonal antibodies bind to different types of amyloid plaque and essentially eliminate them. And what we've seen in clinical trials with differing efficacy, depending on who you ask, is a slowing of cognitive decline. It's important to note that this is not curative. It doesn't reverse the cognitive decline, but it does slow the cognitive decline over time. What this means practically is that patients may have more time to be independent. They can keep their jobs, they can drive, they might, just have more time remembering their family. It can also potentially keep them out of custodial care for longer. And maybe from a science perspective, it just buys them more time to maybe wait for a therapy that could be curative. And we do have an emerging marketplace for these sorts of drugs. We already have competition within the one class. So of course we have Biogen, and I will get into the story a little bit later on. But we also have 3 other competitors who are making antibodies to amyloid beta with a bit of slight differences. For instance, we have lecanemab, made by a company called Eisai, which is a bi-weekly infused drug. It also binds to a slightly different part of the amyloid protein. And this is in phase 3 with results expected in October this year. We also have Roche, who have an antibody called gantenerumab. The difference here is that Gant will be a subcutaneous injection, far more convenient for patients, potentially easier for adherence, which, as mentioned, is paramount these days. They will also be reading out at the end of this year. Finally, we have Lilly, who are making an antibody called donanemab. This will be a monthly IV infusion. However, one difference to note here is that this drug can actually be stopped. So if you're on this drug for about 18 months, the company is saying that you can stop treatment, your plaque levels, your amyloid levels will essentially go down to 0. They are also expected to read out early next year. So overall, we can see that the anti-amyloid space is quite active. Of course, research here has been going on for a number of years. But Biogen really was the first to market, the front runner in this space. And what went wrong? It really is, it has been quite a story, a media circus. And, I'd like to take you through the story of aducanumab, try to maybe sort through a bit of the noise that we've been hearing. So aducanumab was actually in development by Biogen for around 16 years. But the problems really started when it was in phase 3 in 2019. So aducanumab, the phase 3 trials were actually 2 identically designed phase 3 studies in early Alzheimer's disease patients. In March of 2019, as you can see from the headline, the company had done a futility analysis which showed that the studies were likely not going to meet their clinical endpoints and had essentially decided to completely terminate the program. Yes.
Were they completely identical, and if so, why? 2 trials that are identical running in parallel?
Yeah, they were 2 trials running identical in parallel. I'm not actually entirely sure why they did 2, but I'm assuming that the FDA had requested them to do that. I believe they also had some issues with the data in the phase 2 study. So they did run the 2 trials. What they found was in their futility analysis, trials are unlikely to meet their endpoint, so they decided to terminate. Of course, Pharma terminates programs all the time, but this one might have been a bit more emotional because, as I mentioned, Alzheimer's, it really affects almost all of us, right? If we don't have it, we know someone who does, and it's quite a devastating condition. So quite controversial that they terminated, but it happens. But what's even more controversial is that in October of 2019, they said, wait a minute, one of the studies is actually positive. It did meet its clinical endpoint. It does meaningfully reduce cognitive decline, and we will be filing for FDA approval. So what Biogen did was they filed for FDA approval only with the positive study, even though there is a whole other identically designed negative study. They did another small trial, but after months of speculation, and Laura's in the room, this is a project we worked on together. We were always wondering, is it going to get approved? Is it not going to get approved? But in June of 2021, to a lot of controversy again, the FDA did grant accelerated approval in early Alzheimer's disease to Biogen. And, this really set the media firestorm. You know, analysts, doctors, the AdCom, you know, a ton of key opinion leaders really were against this decision. There were accusations that Biogen, like here, colluded with the FDA. They used back channels to make sure that it was approved at any cost. There were allegations because there was a broad label, initially anyway. So really, the medical community was up in arms about this approval. And really, that controversy, if you have been watching the news, you know, in the past few months, has not really stopped. And essentially, from June 2021, it all goes really kind of downhill for aducanumab and Biogen. The drug saw very dismal sales, really, over the next 6 months. And you know, if we're nearing the end of the year, they mean even more sort of access and regulatory roadblocks. So the EU refused to approve it, so did Japan. And actually last week, Biogen pulled their EU application. And perhaps one of the most significant, maybe nails in the coffin for Aduhelm, which came a couple of weeks ago, is that Medicare, so the sort of public body in the US that pays for senior citizens' healthcare, essentially, obviously a big portion of Aduhelm's patient base, declined to cover the drug. So essentially, access was near impossible. And this really, actually yesterday, I had to like add this last minute. Biogen is actually pulling back on marketing of Aduhelm. They're eliminating all of their marketing, their commercial infrastructure, their field force. They're just going to keep, you know, very minimal amounts of manpower essentially behind the drug. And the CEO is being kicked out. So you may think, you know, from all this controversy, all the headlines, you know, really throwing mud in the face of a lot of neurologists. Where does Alzheimer's go from here? Is it really over? Is this the end? I would say no. And you know, you could say the failure, so-called, of aducanumab has led to, you know, some really good developments, I would say, objectively in the field of Alzheimer's. Firstly, I do think it's important to note that this is the first Alzheimer's therapy in 30 years. In other, this has happened in other therapeutic areas, such as MS, for instance, where the first drug that's approved isn't the greatest, but it leads to kind of a flood of new therapies and innovation and investment. And you know, a lot of patients did see this for a win, and I think that counts for something. Secondly, aducanumab's approval, to be politically correct, lit a fire under the behind of the Alzheimer's field. The prospect of these DMTs, disease-modifying therapies, has now led to research in biomarkers, has led to health systems being forced to adopt these new models of caring for early Alzheimer's patients. This wouldn't really have happened if aducanumab wasn't in clinical development. It's also really spurred competition. You know, from a commercial perspective, Alzheimer's can be a big market, and the aforementioned competitors that I mentioned are going full speed ahead. They're investing in the market, they're building it, they're connecting with patients, and you know, the reason is probably because it is possible to get approval, and there is merit to this mechanism of action. And finally, I would say that there is a huge renewed interest in AD R&D, despite the high failure rate and the risk. Since aducanumab's approval, we've counted over $7.4 billion spent in new AD partnerships. Some of these are singular partnerships worth billions of dollars. Some of these, like GSK, previously closed their neuroscience business units, and now because of Alzheimer's are reopening them. So you can see that just because one drug has failed and probably merits its failure, it doesn't mean that the market is over, certainly not for us and our clients. And with that, I hope I've given you a new perspective on Alzheimer's disease, and I'm happy to take any questions.
We're just gonna take one question because we have our industry panelists on the line as well. And then you can chat to Joy if you have any other.
I was thinking that do you think there'll be more resistance towards approval of like FDA approval of drugs targeting like the amyloid hypothesis? We might see more development in like other hypothesis space with AD.
Yeah, I think definitely there's conversations about why this was approved. The United Congress and the FDA itself are kind of investigating themselves as to why this was approved. And it really shows that despite what regulators say, if you don't have buy-in from the neurologists and the prescriber community, your drug really is going to fail. So even if the data's light and the regulators say okay, what the challenge that these competitors are going to have is to have this irrefutable clinical data moving forward.
All right, thank you very much, Joy. I'm sorry for cutting short. All right, so thank you very much for the questions. And again, we'll have some time to mingle at the end in case you have any other, especially to Joy. Sorry, last one gets less time. So we now go on to the second part of this event, which is the industry panel. So what that means is that we have two industry experts on the line, which will be showing up on the screen soon. And thank you very much, Barney and David, for, yes, we have them, for taking care of the tech side. So we have Laura and Jeremy. Hi, Laura. Hi, Jeremy. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hey.
And really the purpose of this piece of the event is it's twofold. The first one to again demystify what it means to work in pharma from the client side. So a couple of weeks ago, as I told you, we showed up what our calendars look like. So part of this conversation is also to ask Laura and Jeremy what they do on a day-to-day basis and how they got to the place where they are, and even how they interact with consulting companies potentially like ours. And the second one is to really give an idea of, with a life science degree, which I assume most of you have, all of the different paths that you can take. One of them could be consulting, but another one could be working in pharma. And of course, pharma is a huge world. So there's so many different ways that you can go within pharma. And Laura and Jeremy here have quite different profiles, so represent the diversity as well that you can get within complex organizations like pharma companies. So what we'll do now is that we'll give both Laura and Jeremy some time to introduce themselves, their background, how they got where they are and what they do. And then we can pop a couple of questions that we have, but of course, we very much welcome questions from the crowd. Laura, Jeremy, I leave the floor to you.
Great. Who did you want to start with? Myself or Jeremy? Hi, Jeremy. Nice to
Hey,
meet
Laura.
you.
Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, I'll start. Hi, folks. I'm Laura Brill. I'm based in New York in the U.S. and I'm seeing a very lovely background over there in London. The weather looks like it's holding up. It's very, very overcast here, so maybe I've kind of transported some London weather here. But
It was 4 hours ago, so.
Okay, it looks very nice. I'm the global commercial lead within hematology for our CML franchise, specifically one of our products, which is called Bosselif. And it's an anchor brand within Pfizer's oncology group that contributes to about 85% of our revenue globally. And I would say a little bit about me, so I'm going to take you through my journey, but I come with nearly, 18 to 20 years of experience. I've been listening to some of the presentations today, and it's fascinating, sort of how the innovation continues, specifically in digital. So I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about my experience. But I come with you. I've worked with major pharmaceutical companies. I come with pharmaceutical background, biotech, as well as health and wellness, and I have a track record of launching, growing, and stabilizing brands for not only companies like Pfizer, which is where I work now, but also Gilead and Novartis. So Jeremy, you and I should connect after this. I've spent the last 5 to 6 years of my career at Pfizer in the oncology group, working on launches and major brands within the oncology group, as well as targeted lung cancer. And I think before I take you through my story, I think there's 2 themes that I'm kind of going to pull out for you guys that I think are important to kind of put some context in some of the conversations that I've heard. One is you're the master of your own career, right? So, and your own destiny, right? So it's your career, right? So I would say that's one theme that I definitely would want you guys to take away. It's your, you can make the pivot, and you can choose to make your career what you want it to be. And to do that, secondly, I would say you need to be okay getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? So making sure that you're taking risks and having that courageous attitude. So those are 2 themes. I started my career in the UK, actually, worked for a company called WPP, supporting major accounts like Coca-Cola and British Tobacco. And you're probably wondering, so my story is Coca-Cola to oncology. That's the other thing to take away from my story today. So again, started out in the UK. Not long after that, moved to New York City, where it has been home ever since. I had a tried and true advertising creative agency career. Longest stint of mine was at Ogilvy and Mather, where I was really grew up at that company, spent about 10 years there. And towards the end of my tenure, held very senior agency roles, but also holding company roles there, not to mention a large book of business with Pfizer, where I work for now. But also worked with clients like Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, Amgen, and companies like Unilever. I then was a founding member in a health and wellness startup agency in Soho, which is downtown New York, where I had the opportunity to work on and really launch Gilead's hepatitis C franchise, which was still today one of the biggest pharmaceutical launches, I think, to date. So hats off to you, Jeremy, for speaking to your experience in a bit, which I know is probably not Hep C, but other parts of the company. It's a wonderful company to work with. So after about
I'll just say I would have had nothing to do for the last several years if it weren't for the successful Hep C launch. So thanks to you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. So after about 2 years there, I actually decided to become a consultant myself, supporting companies like Publicis, Havas, and Omnicom really win new business within their agency. And during that time, I also came across an internal consulting gig at Pfizer. So circling back to Pfizer in the oncology group, which was to support a hematology brand launch. And I would say from day one, I really loved working at Pfizer, working in the oncology group. The entrepreneurial spirit is incredible. We went from 6 to 15 products in under 2 years. And I haven't really looked back. I joined, so I was there as a consultant. I joined full time to help the company oncology group launch their first access and reimbursement hub for patients in the US. And then spent about 3 years in lung, where I managed a portfolio of medicines in the US. One was a launch product, a novel product in non-small cell lung cancer. And then I also sort of managed a mature brand and rebranded that brand into the end of its life cycle. And since then, have definitely loved my experience in the lung team. And now I've spent the last 9 months as a global commercial leader where, we've really achieved, significant revenue within the first year sort of me being in this role. And our goal is really with a focus of re-energizing markets with a new campaign and refresh messaging and resources to really help us continue to achieve growth. I manage a global engagement model where we fuel our top markets with ambition and help provide them with resources and strategies to drive that growth. And I'm also a pioneer within my hematology team to really adopt a new approach to marketing called omnichannel, which is really this new edge of marketing that that pharmaceuticals are starting to take hold of. So I'm the pioneer there. But yeah, that's my story, and I'll pass it off to Jeremy to talk about his story.
By the way, we can still see and hear you. We're just changing the battery of our camera.
No problem.
Should I go ahead and get started
Yeah.
while you change the camera? Okay, sounds good. So very nice to be here today. Thanks very much to the Aerodyne team for inviting me. It's a real privilege. I, just actually moved out to the early stage biotech world, or I'm about to in a couple of weeks after a long stint at Gilead. I'm originally from Ireland. I moved out to the US about a decade ago, went to law school there, and I actually started my career as an attorney at one of the large Silicon Valley firms. And I was really drawn to the Bay Area as I wanted to work in the innovation industries, so technology and life sciences. And I had a really great opportunity to be at a firm that was a leader in both of those areas, and I worked across those different industries in the corporate group there for a few years. So I was working on mergers and acquisitions, new venture financings, and then capital markets and IPOs. So it was a really great experience, and it was at a time around 2014, 2015 where there was a lot of activity in the area. After a couple of years there, I found myself really drawn to the life sciences side of things more so than the tech side of things. I think both industries are really interesting, but I just really love the whole process of companies raising funding to take early stage research through to patients and hopefully in all cases towards a product at the end that helps people with serious conditions. So I really enjoyed that process, and I decided that I wanted to build my career in the life sciences industry and biotech specifically. So after a stint as a lawyer, I actually thought it'd be really helpful to take a quick pause and do a life sciences degree. I think lots of people build fantastic careers in industry without them, but for me, on the one hand, I thought it'd be really helpful in transitioning out of a law firm, and on the other hand as well, I felt that it would just be a really enjoyable experience to go and really immerse myself in science for a year and meet other people who are sort of like-minded. So I took a year out to do that, and then during that master's degree, I had the opportunity to do an internship at AstraZeneca in Cambridge. Actually, they had moved down. This is 2017, I think, and I spent a little bit of time in the business development team there. And I really liked that it was sort of marrying my transaction experience from being a lawyer with more sort of a business side of things, and working closely with the business and scientific teams. So I really enjoyed that work, and at the time did consider rejoining AstraZeneca on a full-time basis after the master's degree, but an amazing opportunity came along from Gilead, who at that point in history, as Laura just mentioned, had one of the most successful launches ever with the hepatitis C franchises, and they had really built up an incredible cash balance as a result of the success that the commercial teams at Gilead had there. And it was now sort of a new priority of how does the business deploy that capital to diversify the pipeline and build growth for the future. It's a really interesting problem that comes up for companies at different stages. Prior to Gilead, Celgene was dealing with it from the success of their oncology franchises. And now you see companies like Moderna that had an incredible success with the COVID vaccines get just a huge amount of capital in the door and then have a need to really go and deploy that to build the business. So that was the sort of set of problems that were at Gilead at the time. It was a pretty great problem to have $30 billion to spend. But the company needed to build out a team to do that. So I was part of the team that was hired to go and deploy that money to build the company further, or build a pipeline. And so it was a really great opportunity because it, like I said, it sort of leveraged the transactional background I had, but allowed me a really great opportunity to learn lots of new things and work really closely with scientists in a team that was at the sort of the forefront of deal making for the few years I was there. So the group was deliberately kept very small, and the goal was to really build a lot of experience for everyone by working across everything from doing traditional sort of venture investing to the partnerships and licensing that's the bread and butter of the industry, as well as very large M&A deals as well, and large collaborations. So, the company did over the past several years deploy almost all that money across probably about 50 deals or something like that. A huge amount, and in furtherance of maintaining the leadership position in virology, but also building out in oncology and autoimmune disease as well. So it was a really fantastic experience, and for me, actually, for personal reasons, recently decided to move to New York, where I'm about to move to. And thought that it would be a good opportunity to think about what's a new set of experiences to get. Just as before, when I had moved out of law into the corporate development team, I thought about what are some new and interesting ways, having spent a lot of time doing lots of transactions and deals, to build a new set of experiences and try new things. And so I really focused looking at early stage biotech companies and looking at taking on an operating role, which is what I'm about to do. I'm about to be VP of Business Development and Strategy at an early stage biotech company. So going to start that in 2 weeks, and kind of excited for what that holds.
Amazing. Well, Laura, Jeremy, I think you've shown us how you can get to pharma, like from very different, like in very different ways and with very different backgrounds. I think it's surprising that your stories are very different from like maybe mine or Laura's or anyone's here. And actually, I think the world is very small, Jeremy, because I interned at AstraZeneca BD unit as well a couple of years later. So we probably work with the same people. But thank you very much. And from now, thank you very much for walking us through like your stories. We'll start asking a couple of questions ourselves, but then we want to open the floor to you guys in the audience if you have any specific questions. As I mentioned, it's really to dig a bit deeper into what Jeremy's and Laura's day-to-day are, how they got where they are, like if they find anything like surprising, right, out of their job, and even how they have worked or work with consultancies like us. So I'll let Laura Hayden Smith here next to me ask first couple of questions.
Awesome. Great to meet you both. Also Laura, so lovely to meet you, Laura Phil. But just a first question around, having been outside of pharma for a few years on the peripheries, what surprised you most when you finally went in?
What surprised me most? I would say one, having a traditional sort of creative agency marketing background. For me, the biggest thing that surprised me was how little marketing goes into the role. You think no, but I would say that's a really artificial one. But I would say what's been most surprising, and I think is a myth, is really everything we do to support patients, right? Whether it's and that was most surprising to me is you kind of think or you have this stigma. I myself was included in terms of being in this big bad pharma industry, and we're just out to make profits. But at the end of the day, the company, and specifically Pfizer, is very much motivated to support patients, right? And so whether it's giving patients early access to the medications they need or helping them, financially, we very much are very much a patient-focused company, and a lot of the decisions that we do make aren't a lot of the times 100% revenue related, right? They have to do with getting treating patients with rare diseases, for example, launching in different therapeutic areas to help patients that have need, and that was the most surprising thing to me, but also a nice surprise, right? Coming into into the pharmaceutical company.
Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally echo that. I was really surprised as well that actually there's just so many people that really do care so much about getting medicines to patients, and the sort of image that's often painted in the media of big pharma, I've pretty much never met anyone like that. At least at Gilead or any of the people I've interacted with. In the industry, you're always going to find some people with adverse incentives, but for the most part, I was incredibly surprised. I guess to add more of a kind of career angle on it, one thing that many people may go through this experience of going through from a sort of professional services type firm outside, as I did from a law firm, or you might go from a consulting firm, a bank, marketing firm, any of these things. I did, find as part of a career development opportunity, let's call it, that you do need to learn how to navigate large organizations. That's something that when you're in professional services, you pretty much spend the vast majority of your time on work product, I would think. At least I did, especially as a lawyer, it's pretty much the deal is going, and 90% of the things you start working on, they finish. You work incredibly hard to get them done. Sometimes something comes up and there's a pause or things don't go ahead, but for the most of the time, you're really coming in where all of the sort of navigation has already been done by someone on the inside to get you to that point. I learned in going into a company, right? It's often your job to come up with or just to start with an idea and then figure out how you make that happen. And many of those things will never actually come to fruition for various reasons. But you do have to spend a lot of time actually building relationships, learning the right way to get things done, and that was a big learning for me.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing, great. Is there any question from the audience for Laura and Jeremy? All right, maybe while you think, I can ask another one. So I would say, what would you think have been some major inflection points in terms of the industry recently that have really changed the way pharma thinks and works? And maybe COVID might be an obvious one, right? But
Mm-hmm.
You can think of others or COVID itself. Maybe Jeremy, you can go first.
Yeah, I think there's been a number of things recently, and COVID is a great example, and that's changed the industry in a few different ways. I think, like most industries, people realize that you can accomplish a lot in a virtual environment. Working on an M&A team, I would have thought previously that you would never do a deal virtually, right? You would go and meet people, you would do your in-person diligence, and we spent probably $25 billion on M&A deals in a purely virtual setting. So that was really incredible, I will say, and how quickly people adjusted to that. One thing that came with that, though, I will say, is that there was a shift to partnerships. So people favored more the lower risk approach of partnering during the pandemic, certainly. And then maybe one other thing that I saw as a result of the pandemic too was this renewed interest in infectious diseases and virology, where a lot of companies had previously gotten out of it. Or had really reduced their sort of interest in the space. Gilead certainly never did, but many others. You saw a lot of companies realizing that it is potentially of high strategic value to have a presence in the space. So they really jumped back in. Other things that I guess I've noticed recently, there are a lot of new technologies coming on board. So RNA therapeutics, really big, obviously mRNA therapeutics, but siRNA has really developed with many approved products. So we've sort of seen, that's just one example. There are lots of other technologies as well, degraders, engineered protein, cell therapy. I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be working in the industry because we are so far from, what was first just a small molecule only business many decades ago to then small molecules and antibodies to now small molecules, antibodies, and 10 or 20 other things. So yeah, those are some things I've seen.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jeremy, with the technical innovation piece. And to add on to that, I think, fueled by sort of COVID, right, and the need to be working remotely. The other thing is just sort of the external way we've started to talk to customers, and we really are thinking, and maybe this is just Pfizer, but I feel like it is more of an industry thing, of ways, really more of a dialogue with physicians and reaching them in different channels. And I know that's a dated concept for folks that are outside of pharma. But it really has fueled pharma to be to take a little bit more risks with sort of how we speak to customers externally. I would say the other thing for me was sort of an inflection point for me within Pfizer has been we've obviously had a lot of growth, whether it's in our vaccines group or the oncology group, but we, in the process, have also sort of reorganized our structure, and so we flattened our structure. So whereas before you had lots of layers, I would say an interesting thing about working in Pfizer these days is really having a mindset of truly, and I want to pick on something you said, Jeremy, in terms of like, you truly have to manage, your own career and find ways to get things done. I would say that's more so the case than ever, as we are remote and, but also there aren't as many opportunities to sort of step up within your career. So a lot of folks are looking at opportunities to work on the business development side, or work for in a global role versus a local market role. So that's also spurred on I think a lot of learning and a lot of sort of skill building that wouldn't have necessarily taken place.
Thank you very much for that. And just following on from your comment, Laura, with all that uncertainty, did you find that the COVID environment allowed you to step up to to the new plate, if you had a topic of interest you wanted to pursue or internal projects that you wanted to drive forward, how would you get involved in such ideas?
In such a complex organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pfizer in general is a very supportive company, right? So, I think as long as you're willing to speak up, right? We have this mindset of, making sure that you're not a jerk, but that you're also courageous at the same time. So there's a process which still, remained regardless of working remotely or, having in-person meetings where, you really are encouraged to speak about your growth and your interest and your longer term plan to your manager. And that really helps signal to not only your manager, but to leadership that you're looking to get experiences. And I will say, as a people manager myself, like there's definitely more ambition in terms of wanting to help people get those experiences across the organization. But we also have this sort of kind of rigid process where you have to rate yourself too. So it encourages you to think about what you're doing, the goals that you're making on a semesterly basis, but also thinking about, what you want to do next. So I think that structure has also helped us, at least our internal sort of corporate culture to rally around change.
Jeremy, what about you? Do you feel like what Laura is talking about is mirrored in the companies where you work?
Yeah, and I guess to go back to the original point about COVID and sort of adapting there, I guess one thing of switching to a virtual world, if you're trying to do new things or get new experiences, it can be a little bit difficult insofar as you're trying to build new relationships with people, but do it virtually. The one positive side of that is it's in many ways easier to maybe throw 15, 20 minutes on someone's calendar for a video call than to actually go and track them down. And that's certainly true for people who are, in global companies in different countries or different offices. So that made it easy. The other part of my job and getting things done, it's both, finding support for things internally if you're trying to do an investment or a partnership or a deal of some description, but then also really getting to know the outside world. And I would say that actually during the pandemic, the shift to virtual really, I think, accelerated our ability to just network within the community and figure out what people are working on in a way that before you might have had like an introduction phone call and then you would like wait to get a physical meeting scheduled at some point. It's kind of crazy actually how fast things have changed in that regard in such a short period of time. I don't remember the last time I had like an audio phone call to learn about a new opportunity. And then, when it comes to, I think, career development, one thing that I think our industry has seen is that there is a lot in terms of early stage opportunities early stage biotech company opportunities that have sort of, that's been filled by very strong funding over the last several years. And I think larger companies, almost like large tech companies, realize that they need to be quite competitive when it comes to career development opportunities to ensure they're attracting and retaining the best talent. So certainly my experience at Gilead was that there was always openness to allow people to try new things. And that meant sometimes people joining our team even who did not have, let's say, the sort of backgrounds that people might normally have in our team, but have performed extremely well in the roles that they were in, and they had shown they can work hard and were given the opportunity to try new challenges. I certainly always felt that was available to me as well, that, there may have been areas of the business that I did not have a traditional training for, but because I had been in a role performing well and investing in those relationships with people in other parts of the business, that was always an opportunity available to me.
I think it's interesting you mentioned that. One thing we've seen through our clients over the course of the pandemic would be small secondments into various teams, so that you can grow those capabilities in a fairly safe, say, test tube-like environment of the pandemic. And in many cases, we've seen those clients stay within their seconded teams due to skill or passion. But very interesting. Thank you for that perspective. Any questions from the audience? Jack?
Yeah, thank you both for sharing your experiences. It sounds like you've had really interesting career journeys. So my question is around work with consulting companies such as Paradigm. So yeah, firstly, have you had experiences working with consultancies? And I'm really interested in, if so, I'm really interested at what point in a project you would decide to reach out to a consultancy. Does it tend to be at the start, you realise you've got a challenging problem, straight away you're going to go reach out to one of these companies, or is it kind of at the end where you try to solve it in-house and then you come to one of these companies? So yeah, at what point would you decide to sort of make that connection?
That's a great question. Can I just check, Laura and Jeremy, that you've heard that online?
I heard it.
Okay, great. Jeremy, maybe do you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to. So yeah, I guess in the deal work world, there's sort of the three key sort of external parties we work with, which are banks who help us on very large M&A deals and on corporate finance, and also sometimes issue securities in the market if we're doing deals. We have to actually manage relationships with them. The law firms that help us when we're executing agreements at the end and getting a deal done. And of course, consulting firms who can provide, at times unique insight that, we do not have at our disposal, or, just provide an additional person to help on a project where there's a ton to be done, and that can really provide a lot of value. So the ways in which we've mostly worked with consulting firms is probably two key things. One, which I'm sure Laura will go into through the commercial side of things, in ascertaining what sort of product revenues you might expect to get from a product if you do an acquisition or do a partnership. Consulting firms I find can be extremely helpful there, and in doing general sort of market research as well around launches. And then the other thing as well is obviously when we're doing deals, we're trying to pick out the best potential party we can work with, and then also always be very conscious of what the competitive landscape looks like. And so working with consulting firms for CI projects is hugely helpful there as well. And on both of those things, we set those up long before we ever do a deal. You can try and find out what the sort of commercial value of a space is before you even necessarily have a company to acquire a partner with, just to understand it better. And then from a CI landscape perspective as well, understanding how the competitive landscape looks and all the different parties out there working on things is hugely helpful even before you're getting to the point of doing a deal too. But certainly if you are doing a deal, you'll make sure to spend the time and money to get that right.
Laura?
Yeah, I would say very similar use cases, albeit on the commercial side. I think the way we work with consulting companies is really the competitive intelligence side. So less about the revenue potential. We kind of have a sense of that, but more so in terms of sort of the data and the key studies that are coming out. So same area, but just sort of driven in a different focus. So competitive intelligence. The second way, which has been a surprise for me, to be honest, in working with the Aradigm team, is helping us translate some of the data. In CML, it's a very crowded, sort of cluttered landscape, and there's a lot of data coming out. I mean, across all industries, and in this rare disease oncology space, I'm sure it's a theme. But just helping us translate data into sort of insights and messaging has been a really nice feature that I've received from the team. And then lastly, I would say the strategic value of, having literally a thought partner there to sort of pressure test your strategies, right? We have much smaller teams these days, and much less time to think, right? So having, for me, the opportunity for using a consultant is really to help pressure test your own thinking, right? And to make sure that somebody's, sort of pressure testing it. Because internally, sometimes you don't really have that person, especially where we're working remotely. So those three areas are how I've seen value in specifically working with consultants, but also the Aradigm team.
Thank you very much, Laura. We have a question. What's your name?
Chris.
Chris, can you speak up so that we make sure that the audience listens?
Okay. Hi, Lauren, Jeremy, Chris here. Can you hear me?
I can
hear
you.
Hey.
Yeah, lovely. So my question will be based on the pharma environment post-COVID, and we have seen what a viral pathogen, airborne pathogen, from a unknown source can have done to us. What proactive measures have you seen is being taken or steps being taken in place now to predict or have a plan in action for something that might or might not happen in the future within the pharma environment?
Great question. Can I check, Laura and Jeremy, that you got that?
I think I heard some of it. Maybe did you hear it?
I can rephrase, but basically it's about pharma's preparation to a next event like COVID, right? What proactive plans or steps are being taken to make sure that if something similar happens again, we're maybe a bit better placed to respond to the emergency. Is that
beautiful?
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Laura, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I don't think anyone could have predicted COVID, right? I mean, looking in hindsight, 2020. But I do think that the pandemic has caused companies to consider the unexpected, right? And to sort of account for that. You know, I'm sure Jeremy has some better insights, you know, coming from his view. But I think that you know, expecting the unexpected, I guess, would be I would say more of a mindset. I will say it hasn't changed. We navigated it through COVID quite successfully, right? So you know, as a company. So I think I'm taking our vaccine aside because I don't specifically work on that, but I think just talking about our structure and sales maintained, revenue still came in. We still got work done, you know, during the pandemic. And so I think what we realize as a company is that we actually can pivot and we can be flexible, and we can take sort of more risks with how we organize our corporate environment, how we, you know, our culture. So I will say there's been no, I'm not part of the mitigation plan for the next disaster, but I will say that, you know, we're, you know, I think a lot of companies are thinking about sort of preparing for more so the unexpected and finding ways to pivot, maintain revenues, but also pivot more quickly. And I think that was a surprise working at Pfizer, because Pfizer is quite a big company. But we were able to pivot during the pandemic quite successfully.
Jeremy?
Yeah, you know, likewise, I'd say from, you know, just an organizational preparedness perspective, I wasn't part of that exactly. I learned how to adapt, and I'm sure, you know, we had task force that were assembled very quickly to figure out how, you know, what organizational changes we needed to make. And I'm sure they've thought about how that might come into play again in the future. And indeed, it'll be likely easier for the entire world as a result of this experience. You know, from a, let's say, new pathogens coming up perspective, you know, Gilead is sort of a leader in virology, of course, and Gilead invests pretty heavily across different infectious diseases areas, even in times where there's not necessarily a apparent immediate need. And, you know, there is always, I think, an acknowledgement that there are potential pathogens, you know, viruses mutate, and that there's always an interest in investing in research and development for broad acting antivirals. And in Gilead's case, you know, it was lucky that we had a program, remdesivir, of course, which was one of the main antivirals that were used during the pandemic and continues to be used today. That was, you know, a drug we had already previously developed and had tested in other areas as a broad acting antiviral. And so having that to hand was obviously hugely successful for the pandemic and helping people, and then obviously from a revenue and commercial perspective too. So I think that lesson reinforced that decision to invest in R&D in infectious diseases in areas that even the, you know, isn't an apparent immediate need, like in HIV, for example, where it's very apparent and immediate. And I think Laura probably right. Pfizer incredibly successful in doing the same thing, investing in coronavirus programs, and then having Paxlovid, and of course, you know, having a great vaccines business too.
Thank you very much, Laura and Jeremy. I know we're at time, but we have one last question. Are you able to stay on the line for a couple minutes more and take it? I mean, Diala.
Thank you. Hi, Laura. Hi, Jeremy. I'm Diala from Paradigm team. So thank you very much for joining us today. If you look back at your career, and in particular the early stages, which the majority of the audience today with us in the room are at that stage, what would be the one advice that you would give them if they are considering a career either in pharma or consulting in life science?
Jeremy, maybe you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to. I think the one thing that I would say, you know, I started as a corporate lawyer, and that gave me a lot of skills that are hugely useful for what I do now, but it's not the path I stayed on. But when I look back at that time, I think the decision to do something that was going to be very challenging, I think has paid off massively, because if you focus on building a good skill set and working on very hard things, you'll be able to use those again, even if you pivot out to a different job. And people will look at your background and experience and know that you are capable of handling complex, difficult matters. So I think even if you're not 100% sure of what exactly to do, I think if you sign yourself up to a big challenge, you will always have opportunities to take the skills you learned, the network you've built, and then also as well, just the credibility you have with having done something very challenging. So I would push people to do the sort of hardest, biggest challenges you can in taking that step in your career. Consulting firms, law firms, banks, marketing firms, PR agencies, they're all challenging places to work, but can provide those experiences.
Yeah, and likewise, my advice would be very similar in terms of the John Maxwell quote, which is if you're not growing if you're not uncomfortable, right? So I think getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, which is very similar to what you're saying, Jeremy, in terms of taking risks, but making sure that you apply that rule where you might know how to do the job, but you might have things that you're learning, right? And acknowledging that you can learn on the job. And I can't tell you how much that has paid off for me as well. And then lastly, remembering that you are the master of your own destiny and your own career. So I think that's fundamental, to especially if you're starting out, that would be fundamental advice, that it's not your manager, it's not your company that's gonna build your career, it's you, right? So apply that philosophy to, every aspect of your role, and sort of, whether it's being in a meeting, networking, or interviewing for a new role, I would say try and apply that mindset that it's you who's owning your career, and I think that will definitely help you pay off in the long run.
Well, Jeremy, Laura, thank you very much. I'll get an applause for you. They're here and they're applauding, and massive thank you from the Aerodyne team and from the audience here for joining us today, and giving us your advice, your experience, your words, your take on the industry. So thank you very much again, and I wish a good rest of your day, given you're on the US side, so your day is still halfway through. So again, thank you, and have a good rest of your day and week.
No problem. Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure. Bye.
Bye-bye. Amazing. Well, thank you very much for the questions. I think as final remarks, and I'm going to call David here impromptu, we just want to remind you, please come. We just want to remind you that, of course, this is the first piece, the first event, like an opening event of our big masterclass that's happening next week. It's been incredibly successful in the past couple of years that we have run it. David is actually part of the first version, was part of the first version of that masterclass. It has now become one of the key pillars of the company. I think that sort of speaks to the power of that event, what it can teach you, the network that it can give you, no matter whether you want to apply to Aerodyne or not after. We've actually just done a research on the background, sorry, not the backgrounds, on what the people that have participated in the previous masterclass end up doing. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but a lot of them went into consulting, pharma, what else?
All various aspects of industry as well. Some still continuing academia at this point, whether they're continuing their studies or chose to take PhD or something similar. So.
But we have received amazing feedback for that, and it's just really like a window into like the tools that we use on a day-to-day basis. So it's the research methodologies that we use, the communication sort of tips and tricks that we work with, and then all of that applied the next day to an immersive case study, which is very similar to the case study that we send candidates when they want to apply in terms of style. So what we're really like looking for in the ideal consultant that we want to hire. So that is next week. We can give you all the information that you want if you want to get in touch with us. Yael, do you want to have a final word?
Yeah, maybe it's a question. Who actually signed up for the masterclass next week?
Okay.
Who is interested in signing up?
Nice.
Okay. Cool.
Well,
come and talk to us, maybe just now when we're having more.
Yeah, exactly.
drinks.
I mean,
Yeah.
my final take to this would be, let's take the rest of the time to just like mingle, ask us questions, whatever you want to know from us. If you have any like burning question on AduHealth, Joy is there to answer them, or really anything else that we can help you with. I think what we want to, what we try every time to put across is that we are like super open organization to any type of questions, any type of feedback. So really just come to us and ask any of us and ask anything that you want. Now I will just thank you, David and Barney, just because they've been behind the tech organization. So applause to them as well. And everything is run incredibly smoothly, as well as, of course, the people organization part of it, which is Nariz hiding there, as well as Diala here. Another applause.
All the time thanks to Nariz. Yeah.
Mostly Nariz, okay. And thank you to Laura as well for jumping with the panel with me. And yes, that's it. Make use of what's there. Make use of us to ask questions. Thank you again for coming
See you
today.
next week.
Yes.
Unless you